Robert Louis Stevenson, The English Admirals, read by Mark Young. Whether it be wise in men to do such actions or no, I'm sure it is so in states to honour them. Sir William Temple. There is one story of the wars of Rome which I have always very much envied for England. Germanicus was going down at the head of the legions into a dangerous river. On the opposite bank the woods were full of Germans, when there flew out 7 great eagles, which seemed to marshal the Romans on their way. They did not pause or waver, but disappeared into the forest where the enemy lay concealed. "Forward!" cried Germanicus, with a fine rhetorical inspiration. "Forward, and follow the Roman birds." It would be a very heavy spirit that did not give a leap at such a signal, and a very timorous one that continued to have any doubt of success. To appropriate the eagles as fellow countrymen was to make imaginary allies of the forces of nature, the Roman Empire, and its military fortunes, and along with these, the prospects of those individual Roman legionaries now fording a river in Germany looked altogether greater and more hopeful. It is a kind of illusion easy to produce. A particular shape of cloud, the appearance of a particular star, a holiday of some particular saint, anything, in short, to remind the combatants of patriotic legends or old successes may be enough to change the issue of a pitched battle, for it gives to the one party a feeling that right and the larger interests are with them. If an Englishman wishes to have such a feeling, it must be about the sea. The lion is nothing to us. He has not been taken to the hearts of the people and naturalized as an English emblem. We know right well that a lion would fall foul of us as grimly as he would of a Frenchman or a Moldavian Jew, and we do not carry him before us in the smoke of battle. The sea is our approach and bulwark. It has been the scene of our greatest triumphs and dangers, and we are accustomed in lyrical strains to claim it as our own. The prostrating experiences of foreigners between Calais and Dover have always an agreeable side to English prepossessions. A man from Bedfordshire, who does not know one end of the ship from the other until she begins to move, swaggers among such persons with a sense of hereditary nautical experience. To suppose yourself endowed with natural parts for the sea, because you are the countryman of Blake and mighty Nelson, is perhaps just as unwarrantable as to imagine Scotch extraction a sufficient guarantee that you will look well in a kilt. But the feeling is there, and seated beyond the reach of argument. We should consider ourselves unworthy of our descent if we do not share the arrogance of our progenitors, and please ourselves with the pretension that the sea is English, even where it is looked upon by the guns and battlements of another nation. We regard it as a kind of English cemetery, where the bones of our seafaring fathers take their rest until the last trumpet. For I suppose no other nation has lost as many ships, or sent as many brave fellows to the bottom. There is nowhere such a background for heroism as the noble, terrifying and picturesque conditions of some of our sea fights. Hawke's battle in the Tempest and Abu Qir at the moment when the French admiral blew up reached the limit of what is possible to the imagination. And our naval annals owe some of their interest to the fantastic and beautiful appearance of old warships and the romance that invests the sea and everything sea-going in the eyes of English lads on a half-holiday at the coast. Nay, and what we know of the misery between decks enhances the bravery of what was done by giving it something for contrast. We like to know that these bold and honest fellows contrive to live and to keep bold and honest among absurd and vile surroundings. No reader can forget the description of the thunder in Roderick Random, the disorderly tyranny, the cruelty and dirt of officers and men, deck after deck, each with some new object of offence, the hospital where the hammocks were huddled together, with but 14 inches space for each, the cockpit far under water where, in an intolerable stench, the spectacled steward kept the accounts of the different messes, and the canvas enclosure, 6 feet square, in which Morgan made flip and Salmagundi smoked his pipe, sang his Welsh songs, and swore his queer Welsh imprecations. There are portions of this business on board the Thunder over which the reader passes lightly and hurriedly, like a traveller in a malicious country. It is easy enough to understand the opinion of Dr. Johnson. "Why, sir," he said, "no man will be a sailor who has contrivance enough to get himself into a jail." You would fancy anyone's spirit would die out under such an accumulation of darkness, noisomeness, and injustice, above all when he had not come there of his own free will, but under the cutlasses and bludgeons of the press gang. But perhaps a watch on deck in the sharp sea air put a man on his mettle again. A battle must have been a capital relief, and prize money, bloodily earned and grossly squandered, opened the doors of the prison for a twinkling. Somehow or other, at least this worst of possible lives could not overlie the spirit and gaiety of our sailors. They did their duty as though they had some interest in the fortune of that country which so cruelly oppressed them. They served their guns merrily when it came to fighting, and they had the readiest ear for a bold, honourable sentiment of any class of men the world ever produced. Most men of high destinies have high-sounding names. Pym and Habakkuk may do pretty well, but they must not think to cope with the Cromwells and Isaiahs. And you could not find a better case in point than that of the English admirals. Drake and Rooke and Hawke are picked names for men of execution. Frobisher, Rodney, Boscawen, Foulweather, Jack Byron are all good to catch the eye in a page of naval history. Clydesdale Shovel is a mouthful of quaint and sounding syllables. Benbow has a bulldog quality that suits the men's character, and it takes us back to those English archers who were his true comrades for plainness, tenacity and pluck. Raleigh is spirited and martial, and signifies an act of bold conduct in the field. It is impossible to judge of Blake or Nelson, no names current among men being worthy of such heroes. But still, it is odd enough and very appropriate in this connection that the latter was greatly taken with his Sicilian title. The signification perhaps pleased him, says Southey. Duke of Thunder was what in Dahomey would have been called a strong name. It was to a sailor's taste, and certainly to no man could it be more applicable. Admiral, in itself, is one of the most satisfactory of distinctions. It has a noble sound and a very proud history, and Columbus thought so highly of it that he enjoined his heirs to sign themselves by that title as long as the house should last. But it is the spirit of the men, and not their names, that I wish to speak about in this paper. That spirit is truly English. They, and not Tennyson's cotton spinners or Mr. Darcy Thompson's abstract bagmen, are the true and typical Englishmen. There may be more head of bagmen in this country, but human beings are reckoned by number only in political constitutions, and the admirals are typical in the full force of the word. They are splendid examples of virtue, indeed, but of a virtue in which most Englishmen can claim a moderate share, and what we admire in their lives is a sort of apotheosis of ourselves. Almost everybody in our land, except humanitarians and a few persons whose youth has been depressed by exceptionally aesthetic surroundings, can understand and sympathise with an admiral or a prize fighter. I do not wish to bracket Benbow and Tom Cribb, but depend on it, they are practically bracketed for admiration in the minds of many frequenters of alehouses. If you told them about Germanicus and the Eagles, or Regulus going back to Carthage, they would very likely fall asleep, but tell them about Harry Pierce and Jem Belcher, or about Nelson and the Nile, and they put down their pipes to listen. I have by me a copy of Boxiana, on the fly-leaves of which a youthful member of the Fancy kept a chronicle of remarkable events, and an obituary of great men. Here we find, piously chronicled, the demise of jockeys, watermen, and pugilists. Johnny Moore of the Liverpool prize ring, Tom Spring, aged 56, Pierce Egan, senior writer of Boxiana and other sporting works, and among all these, the Duke of Wellington. If Benbow had lived in the time of this annalist, do you suppose his name would not have been added to the glorious roll? In short, we do not all feel warmly towards Wesley or Laud. We cannot all take pleasure in Paradise Lost, but there are certain common sentiments and touches of nature by which the whole nation is made to feel kinship. A little while ago, everybody, from Hazlitt and John Wilson, down to the imbecile creature who scribbled his register on the fly-leaves of Boxiana, felt a more or less shamefaced satisfaction in the exploits of prize-fighters. And the exploits of the admirals are popular to the same degree, and tell in all ranks of society. Their sayings and doings stir English blood, like the sound of a trumpet. And if the Indian Empire, the trade of London, and all the outward and visible ensigns of our greatness should pass away, we should still leave behind us a durable monument of what we were in these sayings and doings of the English admirals. Duncan, lying off the Texel with his own flagship the Venerable, and only one other vessel, heard that the whole Dutch fleet was putting to sea. He told Captain Houghton to anchor alongside of him in the narrowest part of the channel and fight his vessel till she sank. "I have taken the depth of the water," added he, "and when the Venerable goes down, my flag will still fly." And you observe this is no naked Viking in a prehistoric period, but a Scotch Member of Parliament, with a smattering of the classics, a telescope, a cocked hat of great size, and flannel underclothing. In the same spirit, Nelson went into Aboukir with 6 colours flying, so that even if 5 were shot away, it should not be imagined he had struck. He too must needs wear his 4 stars outside his Admiral's frock to be a butt for sharpshooters. "In honour I gained them," he said to his objectors, adding with sublime illogicality, "In honour I will die with them." Captain Douglas of the Royal Oak, when the Dutch fired his vessel in the Thames, sent his men ashore, but was burned along with her himself, rather than desert his post without orders. Just then, perhaps the Merry Monarch was chasing a moth around the supper table with the ladies of his court, when Raleigh sailed into Cadiz, and all the forts and ships opened fire on him at once. He scorned to shoot a gun, and made answer with a flourish of insulting trumpets. "I like this bravado better than the wisest dispositions to ensure victory. It comes from the heart and goes to it. God has made nobler heroes, but he had never made a finer gentleman than Walter Raleigh. And as our admirals were full of heroic superstitions and had a strutting and vainglorious style of fight, so they discovered a startling eagerness for battle and courted war like a mistress. When the news came to Essex before Cadiz that the attack had been decided, he threw his hat into the sea. It is in this way that a schoolboy hears of a half-holiday, but this was a bearded man of great possessions who had just been allowed to risk his life. Benbow could not lie still in his bunk after he had lost his leg. He must be on deck in a basket to direct and animate the fight. I say they loved war like a mistress, yet I think there are not many mistresses we should continue to woo under similar circumstances. Trowbridge went ashore with the Culloden, and was able to take no part in the Battle of the Nile. "The merits of that ship and her gallant captain," wrote Nelson to the Admiralty, "are too well known to benefit by anything I could say. Her misfortune was great in getting aground, while her more fortunate companions were in the full tide of happiness." This is a notable expression, and depicts the whole great-hearted, big-spoken stock of the English admirals to a hair. It was to be in the full tide of happiness for Nelson to destroy 5,525 of his fellow creatures, and have his own scalp torn open by a piece of langrage shot. Hear him again at Copenhagen. "A shot through the mainmast knocked the splinters about," and he observed to one of his officers with a smile, "It is warm work, and this may be the last to any of us at any moment," and then, stopping short of the gangway, added with emotion, "But, mark you, I would not be elsewhere for thousands." I must tell one more story, which has lately been made familiar to us all, and that in one of the noblest ballads in the English language. I had written my tame prose abstract, I shall beg the reader to believe, when I had no notion that the sacred bard designed an immortality for Greenville. Sir Richard Greenville was Vice-Admiral to Lord Thomas Howard, and lay off the Azores with the English squadron in 1591. He was a noted tyrant to his crew, a dark, bullying fellow, apparently, and it is related of him that he would chew and swallow wine-glasses by way of convivial levity, till the blood ran out of his mouth. When the Spanish fleet of 50 sail came within sight of the English, his ship, the Revenge, was the last to weigh anchor, and was so far circumvented by the Spaniards that there were but 2 courses open, either to turn her back upon the enemy, or sail through one of his squadrons. The first alternative Greenville dismissed as dishonourable to himself, his country, and Her Majesty's ship. Accordingly, he chose the latter, and steered into the Spanish armament. Several vessels he forced to luff and fall under his lee, until about 3 o'clock of the afternoon, a great ship of 3 decks of ordnance took the wind out of his sails, and immediately boarded. Thenceforward, and all night long, the Revenge held her own single-handed against the Spaniards. As one ship was beaten off, another took its place. She endured, according to Raleigh's computation, 800 shot of great artillery, besides many assaults and entries. By morning, the powder was spent, the pikes all broken, not a stick was standing, nothing left overhead for flight or defence, 6 feet of water in the hold, almost all the men hurt, and Greenville himself in a dying condition. To bring them to this pass, a fleet of 50 sail had been mauling them for 15 hours. The Admiral of the hulks and the Ascension of Seville had gone down alongside, and 2 other vessels had taken refuge on shore in a sinking state. In Hawke's words, they had taken a great deal of drubbing. The captain and crew thought they had done about enough. But Greenville was not of this opinion. He gave orders to the master gunner, whom he knew to be a fellow after his own stamp, to scuttle the Revenge where she lay. The others, who were not mortally wounded like the Admiral, interfered with some decision, locked the master gunner in his cabin after having deprived him of his sword, for he manifested an intention to kill himself if he were not to sink the ship, and sent the Spaniards to demand terms. These were granted. The second or third day after, Greenville died of his wounds aboard the Spanish flagship, leaving his contempt upon the traitors and dogs who had not chosen to do as he did and engage 50 vessels, well found and truly manned, with 6 inferior craft ravaged by sickness and short of stores. He, at last, he said, had done his duty as he was bound to do, and looked for everlasting fame. Someone said to me the other day that they considered this story to be of a pestilent example. I am not inclined to imagine we shall ever be put into any practical difficulties from a superfluity of Greenvilles, and besides, I demur to the opinion. The worth of such actions is not a thing to be decided in a quaver of sensibility or a flush of righteous common sense. The man who wished to make the ballads of his country coveted a small matter compared to what Richard Greenville accomplished. I wonder how many people have been inspired by this mad story, and how many battles have been actually won for England in the spirit thus engendered. It is only with a measure of habitual foolhardiness that you can be sure, in the common run of men, of courage on a reasonable occasion. An army or a fleet, if it is not led by quixotic fancies, will not be far led by terror of the provost marshal. Even German warfare, in addition to maps and telegraphs, is not above employing the Wacht am Rhein, nor is it only in the profession of arms that such stories may do good to a man. In this desperate and gleeful fighting, whether it is Greenville or Bembo, Hawke or Nelson who flies his colours in the ship, we see men brought to the test, and giving proof of what we call heroic feeling. Prosperous humanitarians tell me, in my club smoking room, that they are a prey to prodigious heroic feelings, and that it costs them more nobility of soul to do nothing in particular than would carry on all the wars by sea or hand of bellicose humanity. It may very well be so, and yet not touch the point in question, for what I desire is to see some of this nobility brought face to face with me in an inspiriting achievement. A man may talk smoothly over a cigar in my club smoking room from now to the day of judgment without adding anything to mankind's treasury of illustrious and encouraging examples. It is not over the virtues of a curate and tea party novel that people are abashed into high resolutions. It may be because their hearts are crass, but to stir them properly, they must have men entering into glory with some pomp and circumstance. And that is why these stories of our sea captains, printed, so to speak, in capitals and full of bracing moral influence, are more valuable to England than any material benefit in all the books of political economy between Westminster and Birmingham. Greenville, chewing wine glasses at table, makes no very pleasant figure, any more than 1,000 other artists when they are viewed in the body or met in private life. But his work of art, his finished tragedy, is an eloquent performance, and I contend it ought not only to enliven men of the sword as they go into battle, but send back merchant clerks with more heart and spirit to their bookkeeping by double entry. There is another question which seems to bound up in this, and that is Temple's problem. Whether it was wise of Douglas to burn with the Royal Oak, and by implication, what it was that made him do so. Many tell you it was the desire of fame. To what do Caesar and Alexander owe the infinite grandeur of their renown, but to fortune? How many men has she extinguished in the beginning of their progress, of whom we have no knowledge? Who brought us as much courage to the work as they, if their adverse hap had not cut them off in the first sally of their arms? Amongst so many and so great dangers, I do not remember to have anywhere read that Caesar was ever wounded. 1,000 have fallen in less dangers than the least of these he went through. A great many brave actions must be expected to be performed without witness for one that comes to some notice. A man is not always at the top of a breach or at the head of an army in the sight of his general as upon a platform. He is often surrounded between the hedge and the ditch. He must run the hazard of his life against a hen roost. He must dislodge 4 rascally musketeers out of a barn. He must prick out single from his party as necessity arises, and meet adventures alone. Thus far, Montaigne, in a characteristic essay on glory. Where death is certain, as in the cases of Douglas or Greenville, it seems all one from a personal point of view. The man who lost his life against a hen roost is in the same pickle with him who lost his life against a fortified place of the first order. Whether he has missed a peerage or only the corporal's stripes, it is all one if he has missed them and is quietly in the grave. It was by a hazard that we learned the conduct of the 4 marines of the wager. There was no room for these brave fellows in the boat, and they were left behind upon the island to a certain death. They were soldiers, they said, and they knew well enough it was their business to die. And as their comrades pulled away, they stood upon the beach, gave 3 cheers, and cried, "God bless the King." Now 1 or 2 of those who were in the boat escaped, against all likelihood, to tell the story. That was a great thing for us. But surely it cannot, by any possible twisting of human speech, be construed into anything great for the Marines. You may suppose, if you like, that they died, hoping their behaviour would not be forgotten, or you may suppose that they thought nothing on the subject, which is much more likely. What can be the signification of the word fame to a private of Marines, who cannot read and knows nothing of past history beyond the reminiscences of his grandmother? But whichever supposition you make, the fact is unchanged. They died, while the question still hung in the balance, and I suppose their bones were already white, before the winds and the waves and the humour of Indian chiefs and Spanish governors had decided whether they were to be unknown and useless martyrs or honoured heroes. Indeed, I believe this is the lesson. If it is for fame that men do brave actions, they are only silly fellows after all. It is at best but a pettifogging, pick-thank business to decompose actions into little personal motives and explain heroism away. The abstract bagman will grow, like an admiral at heart, not by ungrateful carping, but in a heat of admiration. But there is another theory of the personal motive in these fine sayings and doings, which I believe to be true and wholesome. People usually do things and suffer martyrdoms because they have an inclination that way. The best artist is not the man who fixes his eye on posterity, but the one who loves the practice of his art. And instead of having a taste for being successful merchants and retiring at 30, some people have a taste for high and what we call heroic forms of excitement. If the Admirals courted war like a mistress, if, as the drum beat to quarters, the sailors came gaily out of the forecastle, it is because a fight is a period of multiplied and intense experiences, and, by Nelson's computation, worth thousands to anyone who has a heart under his jacket. If the Marines of the Wager gave 3 cheers and cried, "God bless the King," it was because they liked to do things nobly for their own satisfaction. They were giving their lives. There was no help for that. And they made it a point of self-respect to give them handsomely. And there were never 4 happier Marines in God's world than those 4 at that moment. If it was worth thousands to be at the Baltic, I wish a Benthamite arithmetician would calculate how much it was worth to be one of those 4 Marines, or how much their story is worth to each of us who read it. And mark you, undemonstrative men would have spoiled the situation. The finest action is the better for a piece of purple. If the soldiers of the Birkenhead had gone down in line, or if these Marines of the Wager had walked away simply into the island like plenty of other brave fellows in like circumstances, my Benthamite arithmetician would assign a far lower value to the 2 stories. We have to desire a grand air in our heroes, and such a knowledge of the human stage as shall make them put the dots on their own eyes, and leave us in no suspense as to when they mean to be heroic. And hence we should congratulate ourselves upon the fact that our admirals were not only great-hearted, but big-spoken. The heroes themselves say, as often as not, that fame is their object, but I do not think that is much to the purpose. People generally say what they have been taught to say. That was the catchword they were given in youth to express the aims of their way of life, and men who are gaining great battles are not likely to take much trouble in reviewing their sentiments and the words in which they were told to express them. Almost every person, if you will believe himself, holds a quite different theory of life from the one on which he is patently acting, and the fact is, fame may be a forethought and an afterthought, but it is too abstract an idea to move people greatly in moments of swift and momentous decision. It is from something more immediate, some determination of blood to the head, some trick of the fancy, that the breach is stormed or the bold word spoken. I am sure a fellow shooting an ugly weir in a canoe has exactly as much thought about fame as most commanders going into battle, and yet the action, fall out how it will, is not one of those the muse delights to celebrate. Indeed, it is difficult to see why the fellow does a thing so nameless and yet so formidable to look at, unless on the theory that he likes it. I suspect that is why, and I suspect it is at least 10% of why Lord Beaconsfield and Mr. Gladstone have debated so much in the House of Commons, and why Burnaby rode to Khiva the other day, and why the Admirals courted war like a mistress.